Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Laura Courtner is our executive producer and Anita Brockington our engineer. In 1984, I founded the Ruscombe Mansion Community Health Center in Baltimore, Maryland, which is the largest and oldest freestanding outpatient holistic healing center of its kind on the East Coast, if not nationally. Offering options that are non-toxic and non-invasive, we have as a community of professionals focused on the well-being of the whole person, using homeopathy, acupuncture, counseling, meditation, rolfing, qigong, massage, yoga, and numerous other options. Our goal at Ruscombe is to assist each person in their healing journey. And rather than focusing only on the ever-changing kaleidoscope of maladies any person might experience in their lives, we work with each person in looking at their physical body, the emotional body, their mental and spiritual bodies. Using this comprehensive and holistic approach offers providers and clients the greatest range of understanding and attention for achieving optimal health. This portion of our program is yet again another little taste of Ruscombe. Joining us this hour is Byrd, a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist with 2 decades experience in helping couples rediscover their affection, strengthen their connection, and return to their relationship center after periods of discord. She has particular expertise in working with couples where one or both partners have mental health and or addiction problems or have experienced trauma. She is also passionate and skilled in helping couples who are struggling with starting a family, infertility issues, and the adjustment to parenthood. Byrd approaches therapy from a strengths perspective, drawing on her training in family systems and psychodynamic theory. She's worked in inpatient, residential, and outpatient settings at Sheppard Pratt and Johns Hopkins, most recently at the retreat at Sheppard Pratt. Karen has a BA in psychology from Drew University and a Master of Clinical Social Work from the University of Pennsylvania and has been licensed in the state of Maryland as a licensed social worker since 2003. Thank you for joining us, Karen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, your training was certainly designed for this time period of the pandemic of 2020. People joke that there will be a corona divorce wave as well as a corona baby boom wave. Why don't we talk about the impact on relationships since the state had an almost 3-month period of shutdown and stay-at-home orders?
Of course. It's been really interesting sort of doing the work that I do at this time in our history, particularly because I've been really impressed at the number of relationships, marriages, and families that are really doing better than expected. I think all of us, are quite worried about, more increased conflict and an increase in divorce rate and what's going to happen, 6 months or a year from now. And while those cases I'm sure will happen and they will no doubt cross my office doors, I think for most people, a lot of people, it's really given people a chance to slow down and really devote more time in a way to their relationships and to their families. We're all, in a constant state of running, it seems, whether it's busy jobs or kids with 100 activities that they're going to and involved in. And there's really not as much time on a usual week or month for families to really be together, even couples to really spend that quality time together. And now we're forced to, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's been a blessing in disguise for many people. And thinking even in the future about, do we really need to be this busy? And do we need to have so many activities and our kids involved in so many things? And it's really helping people to sort of reprioritize, if you will, about how they want to spend their time and how they want to be in relationship with people. So I think that's something I certainly wasn't expecting sort of through this. So I think that's been a bit of a bright spot maybe during a difficult time.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, we know, of course, because you hear about it, read about it, listen to family members or people that some family relationships are stressed, not just from being together, but from being kept apart. Such as those with parents or others in nursing homes or others in quarantine areas. When we're separated from those we love, what advice do you have for what a person can do?
Yeah, those situations have been very difficult, particularly folks who have had, this terrible illness and are, in the process of either trying to recover and in many cases, unfortunately, dying, right? I think it's really important to try to maintain the connection however possible. In many of these cases, we can't see each other or can't see family members face to face because it simply isn't safe. But if there are ways to get messages through to people, either through phone or the old-fashioned way of sending cards and writing letters, any possible connection that you can maintain with that person certainly is helpful to their healing, but helps the person on the other side to stay connected. I've seen some of these amazing stories on the news. I'm sure you may have too, of people being extremely creative. It's going and standing outside of hospital windows or nursing home windows and just being able to see people through glass. So it's safe, but you're able to sort of see your family member and they you. That creativity, I think, has been really interesting to watch too.
Well, it's so interesting because there's been this notion, whether it's from education or businesses, that Zoom and Zoom meetings or some other platform of social congregation through media is good enough and can replace the in-person connection. And even to the point of some businesses saying they can scale back their work week and more people can work at home in the future. Let's talk a little bit about why connection is so important, social connection, of seeing somebody and being able to be near somebody and to feel the presence of another person.
Well, humans we're designed to be social creatures. There's no people who live in isolation for very long anyway, that we're designed to be with others. And that social connection not only sort of feeds our emotional health or our emotional well-being or spiritual well-being, but it really, serves a biological purpose too. Protection, stimulation of all sorts of hormones. And the science piece of it is not my complete area of expertise, but I do know, some pieces about that, it's important for our neurological development, for our physical health. Folks that are connected with people, I think studies time and time again have shown that social connection leads to greater physical and mental health outcomes in general. So it's so important. And, technology is a help, I think, in a case like this with a pandemic where people cannot be together. But I personally don't think it replaces completely that connection of sitting with somebody and being with somebody. And then hopefully someday soon we'll actually be able to touch each other, right? Because that physical touch between people is so important for all of the things that I mentioned, emotional health, physical health, mental health, to be able to feel that you're not alone in this world.
And what's so interesting to me is as the state has started to lift its restriction on being at home and being out and about, we have also then been confronted by civil rights protests around the country, if not the world. And you watch thousands and thousands of people, some with masks, some without, in absolute bodily contact, without, it seems, any regard or concern for what just 2 weeks ago would have been a threatening concept, to be standing, in the public with thousands of other people with or without masks and shouting or calling or singing, which are exactly the way that, experts say the virus is spread. So what it says to me is that humans' desire for justice, for equality, for well-being supersedes the threat of death. And that is, to me, something so fascinating, particularly given that the pandemic has been an unequal partner to the races, affecting, African Americans and other dark-skinned people more. And then the police brutality that has a long, long history in this country, and state-sponsored terrorism, which is a long technique of our nation, unfortunately, both domestically and internationally. And to think that they're coming out both simultaneously at the same time reveals so much about human nature. Yes, we all treasure life, but we also treasure the quality of life and are willing to give up a life for the quality of life. And that, I think, is just a profound commemoration, or I guess the word would be celebration, of our instincts as social animals or as social beings.
Absolutely. I've been really certainly I have many feelings about what's been going on, as I'm sure you do, but I've been interested in that piece in particular too, that our desire not only for justice but to express what we're feeling has completely, superseded sort of the safety sort of pieces of what being together in a large group like that could mean.
And about the aspect of this, while we're talking about civil rights and justice and protest and First Amendment and all things that we value as Americans, grief is so abundant right now. And I don't feel like there's an appreciation in our culture for the status and significance of grieving, and that grieving is a healing motion. It's not something to closet away. Can you speak to that for a moment? Because dealing with couples and reconciliation between couples is no different than reconciliation between desperate parts of our society.
Agreed. So yeah, I think our country or our culture on its best day doesn't appreciate the process of grieving and the emotion and the time in particular that it requires. And certainly many other cultures in our world do things differently, but we do not allow the space and the time for folks to move through the process of healing, because you're absolutely right. It's a process that everyone needs to go through to be able to heal and eventually move on, from a loss, however small or significant. But to your question about reconciliation, absolutely in couples work and in family work, that it's a huge theme. And, I think really tied to the grieving process. Also, I like to think of the grieving process as not just when someone you love dies or something that you love dies or is taken from you. But it could be, a loss on a number of levels. And so in couples, it could be a loss of fidelity often, or a loss of what you thought your relationship or what your marriage was to be, a loss of ideal in some kind of a way. So I think that theme is really predominant in most of the work that I do with folks. And in a way, isn't that a way to think about our own personal growth? Is a letting go of what you thought what was to be or what might have been. That's a grief in and of itself, and a growth process to, okay, it may not look like what I thought it was going to look like, and I need to move through those emotions and create something new.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was just thinking of the loss of trust is the biggest one, and it's the one that is eroding our society overall, because there's this complete and reasonable distrust of a man we call a president. There's a distrust and complete and reasonable one of the policing in this country, because the drug war militarized our police in their thinking and attitude. And I think it's like 25% of ex-military become police now when they leave the military. So they're not trained to protect, they're trained to kill. So there's a problem with that psychologically. And that's, I think, sometimes what happens in couples relationships is a narcissist is trained to kill. It might be unconscious, yes. And that means to kill the equilibrium, to get rid of somebody else's sense of safety, and to control. And so when you have a malignant narcissist like we do as a president, that really describes to me the mayhem that we and the world have suffered under his presence.
Absolutely. And his complete and utter lack of empathy and of concern for anyone else is quite profound. And I think oftentimes in a marriage or in a relationship that you can have a microcosm of that, hopefully not to that extreme, but that there is, some sense of one person being either more important or one person being more in control of the relationship. And those dynamics, even on a person to person or relationship level, are so destructive to one's own psychic ability to function. So imagine that times how many millions of folks are dealing with that in direct result to our president. It's an interesting and terrifying, frankly, thing to think about, sort of the aftermath of that once we're able to move on from his presidency, hopefully in November. My fingers are crossed.
Exactly. Amen to that. Stephen Porges has written a beautiful book on a theory, the polyvagal theory, that he's worked on since 1966. Mm-hmm. And, it's about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and this whole notion of fight, flight, and freezing. And I thought what's so interesting about his conclusion is that the experience of feeling safe is the foundation for a healthy body, a healthy mind, and a healthy spirit. And that's exactly what people don't feel collectively anymore. There is not a sense of feeling safe, whether it's during the pandemic or during a police incident or some other. And that lack of safety is also what drives people apart in interpersonal relationship or leads to abuse of children and spouses. Talk to us a bit about this issue of safety in relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crucial. I don't think I can say that sort of strongly enough. And I am a little bit familiar with that, his work. So it's very important. And on a fundamental level, and I'm not even talking about sort of humans or a child's awareness of their safety, but on a fundamental, like cellular level inside of a person, that autonomic response, if there is no way to sort of lower those anxiety responses or those anger responses or any of those emotion responses, humans can't develop. That's what happens, unfortunately, in childhood trauma or other traumas for folks at different points in their lives, but particularly for children. I mean, you can't grow up and continue to develop in a healthy and normal way if you don't have that sort of fundamental sense of security. And I think that can often happen in interpersonal relationships. And I do a lot of work sort of with couples in that area as well. And I think that that's something that has been not surprising, but very concerning during the pandemic, that kids who are abused, adults who are in abusive or in some way controlling relationships have nowhere to go to escape some of that, right? No break, no sense of peace where they can go to work or go to school and have some semblance of that sense of safety and security, that they are sort of forced together in a home because of our current situation, and they're not able to sort of find those moments, even seconds perhaps, of peace if they're sort of alone with the folks that are unfortunately causing some of that. So it's absolutely fundamental, and I think that's the piece post-pandemic that a lot of mental health folks are the most concerned about. I think there's a lot of things that are going to come out of this, or sequelae, in a psychological sense, but the children and the folks in traumatic relationships, I think we're going to have some real work to do to find those folks and outreach to those people to begin to be able to help them heal.
Well, and it's just so interesting because I, like millions of others, have been sort of at home for months and only recently have started going out for things that are required of me, whether for family or friends or Ruscombe or whatever. And I am so exhausted at the end of the day from something that would have been a normal day. I can barely hold myself together past 8 p.m.
Yeah, I think that's a piece of the sort of psychic or psychological toll that it's taking on you and all of us. And I think a piece of that is that we are going out into the world that used to feel safe. I mean, I think even that, what you described, comes back to a sense of safety and control and security, that we used to be able to go and browse through the grocery store and not think anything of it and take our time and pick our lovely food and bring it home. And that was not necessarily a chore that would deplete us, most of us anyway.
Yeah.
But now it does, because there's so many implications. Even sort of getting gas at the gas station on the way to the grocery store is an ordeal, and something to really think about how you can do everything safely. Even taking a walk in your neighborhood perhaps could provide some of that anxiety too.
We'll talk some more about why walks in the neighborhood matter, and we'll be right back with our guest, Karen Byrd.
Hi, I'm Dr. Karen Shaner, author of The Emerging Mind and Bats Sing, Mice Giggle, also a professor of psychology and neuroscience and a clinical psychologist in private practice. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus, and if you're just joining us, therapist Karen Byrd is with us. You know, her most recent work in inpatient, residential, and outpatient settings have been right here in my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland, at Sheppard Pratt, Johns Hopkins, and most recently at the retreat at Sheppard Pratt. And she is a part-time practitioner at our center, the Ruscombe Mansion Community Health Center. So, Karen, before the break, I interrupted you, and you were talking a little bit about how taking even a walk in our neighborhood can provide some sort of release from anxiety. And even though in some states, including our city, some restrictions of the pandemic have been lifted, there's still reason to be concerned. And a lot of people are still staying home, and particularly elderly people or people with pre-existing conditions. So why is walking in the neighborhood such an important opportunity?
Thanks so much for asking, Zoe. So really it has a number of benefits. So getting outside, fresh air, getting outside of the environment that you've been, in, whether it's a house or a small apartment, just the sheer benefit of getting outside in the air. And hopefully it's a sunny day, because then it has extra benefits of vitamin D and all sorts of things that our body needs. But then you also have the added benefit of moving your body. So the exercise, even, if you're have other physical limitations or maybe be older and you can't walk too far, but walking even around the block a couple of times can give your body, that benefit of moving and some exercise. So I think that's really important, for all of us to make sure you're getting outside every day. And sometimes, even just sitting on a porch, if you have, a porch or an outside space, but being outside can really have just a lot of not only physical benefits, but mental health benefits too.
Yeah, and in our current situation, or as in Japan year-round, who wear masks year-round because of pollution, and in China, it's important to wear a mask and keep social distancing just to relieve the anxiety, if nothing more, and to protect yourself a little further. Now, we talked a little earlier about how Zoom meetings and Zoom gatherings, while they have benefited business and families, and it's certainly an option, an alternative to not having any congregation. I'd like it if you could talk a bit about why Zoom doesn't replace our being in each other's presence. And I know you specifically have focused at times on the role of oxytocin and other hormone systems that, benefit our bodies and our mental health and neurophysiological health, which we don't get from Zoom.
That's right. So I know the most about, or I've done sort of the most research on the role of oxytocin in breastfeeding mothers, humans, but also happens in the other mammal worlds too. But there's something very specific that happens in the release of oxytocin and other hormones when a mother is in the presence of their infant, particularly if they're breastfeeding or nursing. That release for the baby as well as the mother happens sort of when that closeness, sort of skin to skin contact happens. And of course, we know, how important that is for infant, development. Kids and infants that are separated from their mothers have very difficult time developing normally, or as we might expect. The interesting thing about this as well, I've done some work with mothers who return to work, for example, or who, are separated from their babies for periods of time for life reasons and work reasons, and the role of continuing to pump their breast milk while they're away from their babies. So an interesting thing happens, that if you look at a picture of your baby, or hear, even better, your baby cry, even though you're away from them, it can allow for the letdown of milk. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
that happens to a much greater degree, even though you're away from that child. And it certainly happens even more so when you're in person. So it's interesting. And it happens for breastfeeding mothers, even when they can hear the cry of other babies, not even their own baby. So there's something sort of unique in that connection that we can learn from. So you can extrapolate this to when you're older, even when you have a romantic connection with somebody or a very close friendship with somebody. Those hormones are released even just by seeing the person and feeling that love and affection that you have for that person. But it's even greater when you touch the person. So we know that there's something special that happens, between humans when we hug, when we embrace, when we, are intimate with each other. And that's something that is, I think, very difficult, obviously, to do over the phone, certainly, but even over something like Zoom. So it's been interesting in my work during this time that I've been doing a lot, either by Zoom or other video conferencing, and for therapy sessions. And so the folks that I know really well, that I've worked with for a number of months, even a number of years, those sessions seem to go pretty smoothly and pretty much like I would expect. It doesn't replace being in the room with somebody, but it's a decent substitute for the time being. So that's, again, speaks to the prior relationship. So if I have a new person coming in to see me, or even, one of us, makes a connection either professionally or personally over Zoom, you don't have that same sort of shared history or the memory, if you will, of being in that person's company. So those things don't quite go the same. Again, it's a good substitute in this time where we can't be together with people, but it isn't quite the same as if, you, or even if you've done it with family members or close friends.
Well, because it's interesting.
A decent substitute, but doesn't quite get there.
Yeah, and yet because it's been so widely popular, and there's businesses considering, shortening the work week because it's less payroll and less overhead, et cetera, or less use of electricity. It's an interesting exchange for what in the spiritual tradition we would call being in someone's presence. Mm-hmm. Because particularly in the schooling situation, it concerns me horribly that all these young children are being glued to screens that are not good for their brains, not good for their biophysiology. We know it affects their bodies in all kinds of negative fashions, from cell phones to computer screens to iPads. The truth is more than an hour is overwhelming to the system of children, and it breaks the brain barrier, the blood-brain barrier. Anyway, there's a lot of research on it. And so that concerns me, because it's the presence of a teacher who sees a child, feels a child, witnesses a child that can respond best. But when it's all through the screen tabloid, so to speak, the image of something is not the same as the person in real time. And anyway, I'm curious to see which way it will go. My experience of it, like you're saying, is yes, with people with whom I already have established relationship, it's okay, because we have a lot of history, and you can have a sense about reading their face and getting a sense of what they're feeling. But if you don't know somebody and you don't have that empathic history or even sympathetic history, it's a very different experience. But there are other things, that I think we've learned during this time period of the pandemic. Certainly during earth changes, we're likely to see more and more hardship, unfortunately, unless humanity really gets on the fast track of doing what we need to do. that there are things we can do for ourselves to lower our anxiety, to make more balance, which in the specific spiritual traditions will always say we should get used to, whether it's good or bad, meaning what we classify good or bad, this or that is the way they put it in Judaism. We should be able to still maintain our balance, our equity, our, sense of love and compassion. Talk to us about some self-care routines.
It's so important for all of us, right? I mean, I think it's always important to sort of cultivate a routine or a practice. I like to think of it as a practice because I think of it almost like yoga or meditation, that it's something you have to do intentionally, but not only intentionally, you have to practice it to really get good at it. So it's so important. And I think along with that, and sort of it can kind of flow from this, is having a decent sense of your routine. And of course, our routines have been completely disrupted during this time. And each of us have had to sort of create our own new routines of being at home and how we work from home and how we are with our families at home and how we take care of kids at home and all of those things. So I think that is something that I've talked a lot about with, professional folks, but also just in my own life, that first few weeks when this was all happening, that the pandemic was going on, all of us had to shift rather quickly to figure out what those new routines were going to look like. But even still, it's important to have them, even if you have, the benefit of having open time or just kids not in school and not, working full time. Even those days of downtime need to have some routine, I think. So I always recommend that folks generally, you don't have to be so specific to the minute, but in general, wake up and go to sleep at the same time. A lot of these are sort of basic things that we know are good for our health. Getting enough sleep, going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time, having your meals spaced throughout the day. So not eating through the whole day and then eating all of your meals at night, that kind of thing. Getting outside and getting physical activity, so important. We already touched on that. And having some things that you do that are not related to a screen, I think are very important. And you're right, there's all sorts of research out there on the effect of kids, but I think it's just as true for adults. And especially in this age where everyone's, teleworking and a lot on video conference by necessity, to find things in your leisure time that don't involve a screen. And it's hard, I think, a lot of us enjoy watching television or movies or news or things like that, but to give yourself a break and even if you have to find a new hobby or a new way to do it, to do something that does not involve your phone, your iPad, or your computer, right? Just to be able to get away from that. And I think it's especially true for kids always, but especially during this time, that children desperately need routine. They need to know what to expect. They need to know what's going to happen generally sort of as the days flow by. And that goes a long way, I think, to lowering sort of our anxiety, our heightened arousal and worry during a time like this.
Yeah, I think it's great advice, and I hope those in our audience heed your words. Our guest, if you're just joining us, is Karen Byrd, and we'll be back in a moment.
Hi, my name's Meg Daly-Olmert, and I am the Director of Research and Development for Warrior Canine Connection. My book is called Made for Each Other, Biology of the Human-Animal Bond, and you are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Please visit me at www.warriorcanineconnection.org.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Karen Byrd is with us. She's a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist for the last 2 decades or more, and she specializes in part in couples therapy. So I thought, Karen, it would be important to bring some of these things up because you specialize in working with couples where one of the partners may have mental health or addiction problems, and certainly with the quarantine or the challenges we're facing as a world and as a nation with civil justice and the challenges we have faced all along in our lives but now are sort of openly speaking about and hopefully making efforts to change. How has this affected the couples you work with?
Very good question, Zoe. So I think it's been very challenging for all of us, without question, but particularly those that are the most vulnerable to stress, anxiety, depression, addiction, prior even to this pandemic are really struggling. I think folks with depression, certainly that's fed by isolation, and aren't we all isolated right now? And certainly, with these folks that struggle with anxiety, that is sort of fed on fear and worry. And of course, we are all sort of experiencing parts of that. So I think folks are really struggling. And I certainly have seen that in my practice and talked with, my colleagues about this during this whole time. And unfortunately, I feel like the trauma really of being quarantined and dealing with this is going to be very hard for folks that already have issues, and hard for even the greater population as this continues. So I think we're likely to see folks struggle maybe even more so as time goes on.
Yeah, and we're talking in the spring, early summer, actually, almost summer solstice, and it's likely to continue into 2020 in the fall, maybe even into the winter and the spring of 2021. And as I mentioned, and I like to bring it up as much as it makes me unhappy to do it, is that earth changes are here. And the environmental collapse is a reality, and we are bound to see, whether it's forest fires or air pollution or drought, whatever, tornadoes, hurricanes, everything is more severe and more extreme, and whole communities get cut off from their local municipalities. There are emergency situations where people have to leave their home or they have to stay without resources. And so, to me, the silver lining of this challenge, beyond coming to an awareness about how pollution really undermines the health of not just the ecosystem, but every living form in it, including humans, animals, trees, etc., is that this is an expression of what our future might look like in a much greater way. And so I think having community and having a sense that we are all one, I don't know if that helps people with severe depression. And I don't know what it does for a person in extraordinary sense of anxiety, but what are some of the visualizations maybe people can do when they feel if it's not fight, it's not flight, but freeze, which happens to many people in trauma? What are some opportunities that they can do for themselves?
Yeah, I think that is so important, whatever sort of state folks might find themselves in, to reach out for whatever help is there, and to be constantly, is true for all of us, sort of reminding ourselves that we are not alone. We may feel alone, and we may be physically in our space at the moment alone, but that all of us are connected in many ways, but connected, folks are connected to somebody, and to sort of always be remembering that is sort of at the forefront of all of this, because particularly folks who do suffer from depression and also from addiction, is that it feeds in isolation. I think the nature of sort of some of the treatment that's out there for folks, especially with addiction issues, is very social. And it's very much sort of group focused. You think of the AA or NA, Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous model, is it's a very social group experience, and that it's acknowledged very, very strongly that none of us can do this by ourselves. And I think that that's really true in life, isn't it? That we are not meant to be in life, by ourselves. And I think for a lot of folks who struggle with these issues, connection to some spirituality is really, really important for getting through. Whatever God or whatever spirit you believe in tends to make any of us feel less alone, right? And less isolated, and sort of give that sense that someone and something is out there caring about us. And I think that's what we all need in in these moments, but particularly folks who are really struggling, that connection to something outside of ourselves.
Yeah, I remember
So
years ago
essential.
somebody saying, let's say you live in an apartment and your view is of a parking lot, to pull out of magazines or online, if you can print them out, pictures of nature, sunsets and sunrises and lakes and rivers and things that are really connect you to nature, because we are essentially carbon beings made of the exact same, or star beings as they say, or stardust, that this is a reality. It's not just a metaphor. And so that it's like when you were talking about oxytocin, that when we are linking ourselves through images, because we maybe can't be there personally, to those things that enrich our heart and give us a sense of peace and well-being, it can be through a magazine picture, and to tape it on your wall and look at it before you go to bed, or put it in your bathroom and put it on the mirror, or write yourself messages, you are loved, whatever it is, but to reaffirm the positive. Myself having had experiences of both anxiety and depression, I know how important it is to try to re-inspire oneself and to have faith that there are opportunities for change, and that change happens even when we do nothing. But if we do something affirmative and positive for ourselves, change is more likely to occur at a much greater rate. One of the other things is that I know I looked at your website and you have this beautiful quote from the Little Prince, and it says, "Love does not consist of gazing at each other, but in looking together in the same direction." That's a beautiful quote. Tell us what it means for you.
So I love this. It's actually something my husband and I use at our wedding. So when I was putting together my website, I just it really felt like I wanted to use it as well. But what it really means, I think, to me, sort of as a person, but also in my work with relationships and with folks, is that a love, a connection, a relationship, whatever word you want to use, it's a dynamic kind of thing, right? It isn't something, at least ideally anyway, that should remain the same or should remain static. A connection, particularly a romantic connection, it starts with you looking at somebody else, right? And it becomes that dyad. But I think for it to grow and to develop and to, keep moving through time as folks are together longer, that looking outward, that shift has to happen. It's almost like then your relationship kind of becomes your compass of sorts that you navigate through life. The waters can be rocky, and things can happen in anyone's life, and to be able to sort of rely on that relationship to steer you and to be generally looking in the same direction. This is particularly true for intimate partners, that you don't have to agree on everything by any means. None of us do, right? But that if you're generally oriented in the same direction, it's a pretty good place to start. It's a pretty good place to be. And then you can work through many things if you're generally focused on the same things or value the same things.
And you also have this other quote from the same book by the French author, from the book The Little Prince. You write, "It is the fox who bestows upon the little prince 3 important life lessons. One sees clearly only with the heart. Anything essential is invisible to the eyes. It's the time you spent on your rose that makes your rose so important."
That's right. I love that. Yeah. It's really about, being with somebody or being connected to somebody. I mean, this is true, I feel like, as a therapist. It's about holding space for somebody, whether it's a friend, whether it's an intimate partner, whether for me with a client or, other medical professionals, their patients. It's about giving space and giving permission to people to have that experience together, whatever it is, whatever that they need to at that particular moment, and to sort of feel seen. So I think that's really important.
I also find, back to this issue of self-care and self-improvement, particularly with anxiety and depression, is to hold the image of oneself that one wants to become in the heart, and to almost treat yourself as a child. People talk about the inner child and retrieving your child. So much anxiety and depression stems from instances of trauma from when we're children, and it doesn't have to be anything that's enormous. It could whatever it is to that individual, but some of the restoration can be done through self-imaging, I find, in the heart. And in the same way you communicate with animals or anything else, when you place an image of that which you want to be in communion with in your heart, and then quietly listen to what it says to you, whether it's an image or a sentence or a smell or a sound. That's how I do animal communication, is I call the name of the animal 3 times. I let the image of the animal fall into my heart. I feel the presence of that being, their spirit, because we are all light beings connected as spirit beings anyway. And we ourselves are multidimensional beings, so we have a physical body that might have symptomology of anxiety, but we also have a soul, or even the oversoul, which is divinely balanced and is always there to help us if we know how to reach it. And so that's why I find like your quote is so important for the individual as well. Well, Karen, I want to thank you for being with us and encourage our audience, if they're interested and they live here in Maryland or want to work with you at a distance. Karen Byrd's phone number is 443-613-4152. That's 443-613-4152. And you can learn more about her work at the Ruscombe Mansion website. That's www.ruscombe.org.